welcome back. So what I want to focus on today is genetic testing, and we'll do a very quick recap from the video yesterday, and then I'll focus on some exam style questions so we can have a look how to focus on those. So very quickly, predictive testing is obviously testing the little fetus or testing the human, the adult should I say, testing the adult to be able to check, do they have that gene, do they have the faulty gene or the faulty allele? So if they have the faulty allele, then they might be a carrier, okay, if they only have one faulty allele. So this will allow those people to plan for the future. It'll help them make the decision of whether to have a termination or not. Particularly, some people might agree with this, some people might not, and of course that's an ethical issue there as well. It can cause miscarriage if the fetus is tested, then it can cause miscarriage, which of course you'd link in with that miscarriage one, the fact that it can cause a risk to the mother as well. Don't tend to have those as separate answers. And of course there's implications for society. So who should be told? Should employers be told? Should the insurance companies be told? Etc. Now, PGD is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. What that means is they would test the cells of the embryo to be able to check whether that's a carrier. If it was a carrier, then of course that embryo would be destroyed, and there's a lot of embryos involved here, and so a lot would be destroyed. And so it'll allow them parents to be able to choose the characteristics of their child, which of course is an ethical implication. Should people be able to choose? And of course in science you're not expected to be able to give your own opinion. You've just got to be able to weigh up both sides of the argument and discuss those in your answer. So the other implication is, when is it acceptable? When is it acceptable to choose which diseases should be tested for or not? And these are issues that you're not expected to answer. You are just expected to explain the ethical implications and what some people might think is right and wrong, etc. Of course, you've got false negatives, false positives. So when somebody's told that they've got the disorder when they haven't, so one of these little embryos might have been tested as positive for, say, cystic fibrosis, whereas in fact it wasn't, and of course that was destroyed. So that's another implication. And then prescription drugs. So before drugs are prescribed, they would check to see whether that person has the gene. If they did have the gene, then that of course is the instructions to make a protein, and an example of a protein is going to be enzymes, which of course would help that drug to be broken down to prevent side effects. So just a very, very quick recap there. Obviously it links to the video from yesterday. So what I want to move on to now is looking at some exam style questions. So the first one is, describe the ethical implications of PGD. What PGD is, of course, you are expected to know within that question what PGD is. And of course, that is when you are testing that little embryo to check, does it carry that genetic disorder or not? Okay, so ethical is all about when is it right or wrong and what are the issues surrounding that. Remember, don't give your opinion, just state what the implications are. Okay, so 2 marks there, so we need 2 clear points. Now the first most obvious one is the fact that when these embryos are tested, if they are tested positive for that disorder, then they are destroyed. So describing the first implication, lots of embryos are destroyed. And that's going to be the most obvious one to go with. The second one is, when is it acceptable? Which disorders are chosen to be tested for? Okay, but more down the route of, when is it acceptable? Or should people be able to choose their characteristics of their child? Okay, so it does link in with those ethical implications. So should people be able to choose? Or is it going against nature? Okay, so 2 possible issues there. Now, the second question, which would be a 4-mark answer, And quite often here you are given two people in a particular scenario. So this one, Alison and Mark, have relatives that have cystic fibrosis. So they are presuming that they might be carriers. So Alison wants her unborn baby to be tested. So the fetus, she wants it testing, but her husband doesn't. So quite a common a common scenario here that I bet a lot of people would find who work in genetics, obviously in the hospital. So when the mum wants to be tested, dad doesn't. So again, we're not focusing on whether we think they should be tested or not. What we are doing is looking at the reasons of why she wants it to be tested, but then why the father might not. Okay, so within your answer, don't forget to talk about both these people. So you've got Alison, first of all, that we want to discuss, and then we'll move on to Mark and why he might not want that child to be tested. Okay, so Alison wants it to be tested. Why does she want it? Well, of course, she wants to find out whether the child is a carrier or whether it has that genetic disorder. So she wants to find that out, which of course is the first positive really, or why she wants to actually try and find that out. Okay, the other, even though you might think, why is this a positive? The positive or the for argument is so that they can decide whether to have a termination. So whether to have a termination or not, they would class that as a for argument. Now, Mark doesn't want the baby to be tested. One of the reasons probably for that, or there's a couple of reasons really. Remember, this is a 4-mark answer, so you'd want 2 marks for each. Now, the first one is there is a big risk of miscarriage. If she has that genetic testing, there's a risk of miscarriage, but also there's a risk to the mother. And don't forget, these two should be 2 separate arguments. Okay, so 2 separate arguments there. However, they would all come within the same marking point, so be careful there. The other thing is, of course, there's false positives and false negatives. Okay, I'm just writing these as notes. Of course, make sure you write the words false negative or false positive. And again, even though it looks like the 2 separate points, these are actually within the same marking point. Okay, so be very, very careful here. Okay, now the last question, we just turn over. Sometimes you'll be given 2 couples. Okay, this would actually be a 6-mark answer. So Mike and Samantha have a newborn baby on the way. They want to have their child tested. So they want to have that newborn tested to check whether it's a carrier or not. Fred and Barbara don't want to have their child tested. So discuss the reasons why the 2 couples have different decisions about making it. Now, before we move into jump in to answer that question, there's key points that you need to remember for the exam. So the first one is, whenever people are deciding whether to have their baby tested or not, the first thing to think about is the economic side of it, which is all linked to cost. Okay. The next one is about ethical issues. Says Little Church. So ethical or religious issues. So whether people might think it's right or wrong and why they might think that. Medical is the next one. And then you've got people's circumstances. So everybody has different circumstances. And some people may choose to have that child tested for those reasons. Okay, you can also get away here with general. Now, general implications. Now, when this type of question's been on before, the marking criteria, you never know exactly what that exam board will be looking for. However, previously, with experience, what we've found is that you must have at least 2 of these sections that you must have a look at within the discussing the reasons and the decisions why. Okay, so I would get used to at the side of an answer just jotting these down, so you make sure that you stick to 2 or learn 3 as a minimum, so that you make sure you've covered all bases, really. Okay, so linking back to this, we've got Mike and Samantha who want the child tested. So let's go through some reasons of why they might want that child tested. The first reason is because of the economic. They may not be able to afford to look after that child if it has a disorder. So they can't afford the child or can't afford the medical treatment. Obviously, if they weren't in the UK and they're having to pay for medical treatment, then that is a major issue for some people that might affect their decision. So the medical costs. Okay. Now, when it comes to the ethical reasons, Barbara and Fred might not want to be tested. They might not believe in that testing. Okay, they may not want to interfere with nature and may disagree with termination. So they might disagree with termination. They might disagree with genetic testing in general. Remember, I'm just giving you some ideas here. I would just stick to maybe one, as long as it's from each of these sections. Or they might not want to interfere with nature, might not want to find out. Might not agree with, obviously, finding out about that child's characteristics and making that decision. Now, the medical implications, of course, for these ones who don't want to have their child tested, again, the medical is due to miscarriage. So they might be really worried that, obviously, Barbara could miscarry that child, but also the false negatives and false positives. So that links into the medical issues as well. Mike and Samantha, who we've said they want to have their child tested, that might be due to circumstances. If they've got other children that they need to consider, then that might be why they want to choose whether to have a termination or not. Okay, whether they can afford that. Now, the general circumstances links to everything else really that sort of doesn't fit in this section. The first one is, for these ones, they don't want to have that child tested. They might not want to know. And some people don't, so may not want to know. But also, they might have had been through IVF treatment before, had lots of miscarriages, and tried for a long time for that baby, and therefore they may not want to have it tested. So if they've had lots of miscarriages in the past, then that might obviously sway their decision. So what I'd encourage you to do, obviously this is just a general question, what I'd encourage you to do is make sure that you know the decisions which people have to make sure you know the areas that these decisions fit into, whether it's economic, ethical, medical, circumstances or general. Make sure you can give an example of each one, because those could link to any circumstances. If somebody chooses to have that child tested, it could obviously be due to medical mostly, or the circumstances. If people don't, then it's more linked to the ethical and religious views. The medical views, obviously miscarriage, and false positives and false negatives, or general, the fact that they don't want to know. So learn those, be able to apply that to any sort of question.